Dobrý wieczór, szanowni państwo. Buonasera. Buonasera, jak powiedział papież Franciszek. Ja będę mówić po angielsku. The broken English is the lingua franca of today's world. The situation of our church today, on the threshold of postmodernity, strongly resembles the case at the beginning of modernity, just before the Reformation, the Protestant and the Catholic Reformation in the 16th century. The scandals of psychological, spiritual, sexual abuse have played a similar role today as the scandals of the sale of indulgences in Martin Luther's time. And then, so today, these scandals, which at first seemed like a marginal phenomena, have turned out to be an alarming symptom of a severe illness of the whole system of the Church, requiring profound reform. Pope Francis recognized that the abuse crisis had deeper causes than the failure of many individuals. It was and is a systemic crisis, the outcome of a system involving a particular structure of relationship in the Church, style of specific style of leadership, and exercise of power and authority. This system was expressed in a specific type of theology, especially ecclesiology, a certain kind of preaching and piety, and particular style of Christian art. Let us think about how the system came out, how it can be transformed, and what can replace it. Pope Francis called the system clericalism. He proposed a healing process, a synodal way, a common way, synodos. Through the process of synodality, the rigid system of clericalism is to be overcome and transformed into another form, a synodal church. The church is a living organism, a dynamic network of mutual communication, which is more consistent with the spirit of the gospel and at the same time more responsive to the needs of contemporary humanity. Pope Francis compared the synodal journey to that of Abraham, the father of faith, who heard God's call and set out on his journey. Also, he did not know where he is going. The Synodal Church is therefore not a ready-made model as a goal of the journey, but a process. The goal is the journey, and the journey is the goal. This process, which has already begun with the preparation for the Synod of Bishops in 2023 and 24, must not end with the Synod in Rome, but is to become a permanent form, a permanent method, methodos of the life of the Church. The understanding of the synodal process is already changing in the first years since its launch. It is becoming more evident that this process cannot remain an internal matter of Roman Catholic Church, but its ecumenical, interreligious, and intercultural dimension must be broadened and deepened. It is not merely a matter of making the Church's institutions more effective, but according to the important encyclical Fratelli Tutti, of striving for human fraternity. This process is about deepening the culture of communication at different levels. It includes a renewal of spirituality and theology, it seems communication with God, and the deepening of pastoral practice, the communication within the church, relations between bishops, priests, laity, and deepening of ecumenism in the broadest sense, communication with other Christian churches, other religions, and the secular world. The synodal way is, in many respects, a continuation of the reform called by the Second Vatican Council. In my view, the main task that the Church faced at the Second Vatican Council was a transition from Catholicism to Catholicity. What do I mean by these two terms? Catholicity is the openness, universality, and dynamism of Christianity. It is one of the essential marks of the identity and authenticity of the Church, along with her unity, holiness, and apostolicity. Unity, holiness, Catholicity, and apostolicity, fidelity to tradition, to the heritage and the mission of the apostles, are given to the Church as a seed, as a gift, and as a task to be developed in history on the way to its full realization in the eschatological completion. Throughout history, the Church has been a communio viatorum, a community of pilgrims, to confuse any particular historical form of the Church, its institutional form, and its theological knowledge with the Ecclesia Triumphans, the victorious and perfect Church of the saint in heaven, is the heresy of triumphalism. Triumphalism and clericalism are characteristic features of that form of the Church which I call Catholicism, a closed social cultural system that lacks the ability to interact creatively with its environment. When the Church stops on the way to its eschatological goal, Catholicity, when faith turns into ideology and unity into uniformity, a system of Catholicism is formed. Catholicism emerged after the collapse of medieval Christianitas as a counterculture against Protestantism and modernity, and later as a defense against the modern philosophies and ideologies, especially positivism, liberalism, and socialism. It was a whole system encompassing a particular institutional form, a style of management, a style of theological and political thinking, a style of piety and pastoral care. In opposition to the Enlightenment, Romanticism created an idealized image of the Middle Ages, and the Church presented this nostalgia, this nostalgic fiction, as an ideal example. Its manifestation in culture, Neo-Gothic, Neo-Renaissance, and Neo-Baroque in the architecture of churches, and Neo-Scholasticism in philosophy and theology, express nostalgia for the past. Ironically, Neo-Scholasticism, which was promoted as an official theology of Catholicism, in some aspects copied its main opponent, the scientism of positivism. It wanted to offer rational system of theological claims. In doing so, it obscures and weakens the spiritual dimension of faith, the sense of mystery and paradox in Christianity. Beginning with the father of positivism, Auguste Comte, even some non-believers have been fascinated by the perfect external structure of Catholicism as a closed system. Thus, a Catholicism without Christianity emerged, which, especially in political thought and practice, showed a great affinity for authoritarian regimes. A similar type of political abuse of Christianity still exists today from the Russian Orthodoxy. We can it the Patriarch Kirill. I heard a nice joke that Putin asks Patriarch Kirill, does God exist? And Kirill said, I hope he doesn't. And to the American religious right, or the European nationalist and populist, torpedoing the process of European unification. Official Catholicism, like all closed systems, lost after Enlightenment the ability to creatively communicate with the other cultural social systems that were developing rapidly at that time with modern science, art, philosophy, and politics. The failure to recognize in several major social cultural changes signs of the times quickly enough has contributed significantly to the exculturation of Christianity and to the secularization of Western society. Due to the confessional division of Christianity, ideologization, clericalization, and intellectual self-castration of a particular form of the Catholic Church, particularly between 1848 and 1958, the Church began to lose its generative power. When the Church failed to recognize in time the consequences of the transition from an agrarian to an industrial society, it lost a large part of the working class. When it reacted with panic and repression to the change in culture, science, and philosophy, especially at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, it lost a large part of intelligentsia. When the Church similarly reacted to the changes in the understanding of sexuality and sexual behavior of the young generation in the second half of 20th century, it lost a large part of the youth. Now it may lose a large proportion of women if it underestimates the current changes in women's self-understanding and their place in society and in the Church. Perhaps many of the good initiatives from the concern for the workers' question in the Catholic social teaching to the symbolic gesture of Pope John Paul II, the rehabilitation of Galileo, and the mea culpa, the self-critical attitude to the scars of history, including the defense of human rights and freedom of conscience in the document of the Second Vatican Council, and a number of similar steps came perhaps too late. The reforms of Vaticanum II bore good fruit in the field of ecumenism interreligious communication, the transition from the triumphalistic, papacy-oriented model of the Church to the emphasis of episcopal collegiality and on the dignity of the laity, etc. However, many of the intentions and dreams of the inspirators and fathers of the Council remained unfulfilled. The magic word of the Council was dialogue. But instead of honest dialogue inside the Church, disputes between the proponents of different interpretations of the Council, between the proponents of the hermeneutics of continuity and the hermeneutics of change, grew into tensions, cultural wars that weakened the credibility of the Church. The Church's dialogue with the contemporary world soon ran into obstacles on both sides. The first sentence of the Constitution Gaudium et Spes sounds like a marriage vow of love, respect, and fidelity of the Church to modern men. However, at the time of the so-called Second Enlightenment, the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, the Church seemed to modern men to be too old and not very attractive bride. In Gaudium et Spes, the Church declared her willingness to co-create the contemporary society in partnership with all people of goodwill, still, in most conciliar documents, and then in her practice in the post-conciliar period, she focused primarily on herself. Even today, many within the synodal journey still focus primarily on the reform of the institutional structures of the Church. The reform of the institutional structures of the Church is a necessary but not sufficient step on the path of synodal transformation of the Church. It can be neither the first nor the last step on this path. According to St. Augustine, the Church is Ecclesia semper reformanda, the Church ever renewing, reform, change of the form, can only be truly beneficial and meaningful if it allows a deeper understanding of what constitutes content and meaning, the heart of the matter. The Church is a sacrament, theologically speaking, a visible sign of invisible grace. Everything visible about the Church, its form, its institutional structures, its worship, its doctrine, is a sign, a symbol, referring behind and beyond itself to the hidden meaning. What is visible in the Church expresses, represents, and interprets the invisible heart of the matter. This is grace, the life of God that is infused, incarnated into creation, into the world, into human souls, into human stories and activities, and human culture and society. God enters history most radically through the Christ event, involving the person, life, and teaching, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. Through him, and with him, and in him, the dialogue between Creator and creation, between God and humanity culminates. The incarnation, the passion, and the resurrection of Christ are unique but unfinished events. In my book, The Afternoon of Christianity, I write about the Eastern drama that continues in the Church's history and the lives of believers. Christ suffers in the people who suffer. The conversions of individuals and the renewal and reforms of the Church are resurrectio continua, a continuing resurrection, a participation in Jesus' victory over death. In any form of church, loses its authenticity, credibility, clarity, persuasiveness, and vitality. It must be transformed, reformed. The reform of any form of the church is necessary not only because its environment, the social culture context, is changing, but because the content that the forms is to serve, namely grace, the life of God itself, the presence of the risen Christ, is dynamic in nature. None of the particular forms of Christianity throughout history can be considered perfect, fully exhausting the depth, richness, and dynamism of God's presence in the world. Here we perceive God's presence only partly, as in the mirror, as in the puzzle, said St. Paul. There is always a need to open up more space for the action of the Spirit of God, who throughout history has been gradually bringing us into the eschatological fullness of truth. There is always a need to encourage us to keep searching, to keep courageously crossing horizons, and at the same time to know humbly that no step on this journey is the last. We have to expose ourselves to the dynamism of God's Spirit, both in the inner sanctuary of the human heart and the conscious and in the sign of the times, in the historical events through which God speaks to us. In my book, The Afternoon of Christianity, I offer a method I call kairology. Kairology is the phenomenology and hermeneutics of God's presence in the world, especially in the events of history, in the processes in culture and society. Kairology wants to complement and enrich the sociological diagnosis of our time with spiritual discernment. Culture of spiritual discernment includes distinction between the spirit of the age, zeitgeist, and the sign of the times. The spirit of the time, zeitgeist, is the language of this world. The signs of the times is the language of God through the events of this world. Disciples of Jesus who are, according to the New Testament, in the world, but not of the world, face two dangers. On the one hand, uncritical conformity to the spirit of the age, and on the other hand, ignoring the signs of the times. Conformity to the spirit of age is manifested by dependence on public opinion, ideologies, prejudices, and stereotypes. Understanding the signs of the times presupposes an inner freedom from fashionable ideologies and utopias. Its basic premise, however, is a contemplative approach to reality. Contemplation is a royal journey from the surface to the depths, from the ego to the self, a descendant into the inner sanctuary of conscience, where we can listen to the voice of God, discern God's voice in external and internal noise. Pope Francis rightly stresses that the process of spiritual discernment, which presupposes a space of silence, contemplation, and adoration, is the most important part of the synodal journey. When Chesterton was asked in a journalistic questionnaire what was urgent to change in the world, he replied, "It's me, gentlemen." It is certainly not the ultimate goal of reform, but it is a necessary starting point. Thank you.